Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll, and this is Black Cats Run. Recently, we released the preface for my forthcoming book, The Blood and the Rain. Received a lot of positive feedback. Really appreciate all of the support. Wanted to bring you one other section from the audiobook that is also being worked on. So what follows is Chapter 3, The System Defends Itself. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 3. The System Defends Itself. Nicolaus Copernicus's famous work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolution of the heavenly spheres, was published after his death in 1543. The most popular version of the story holds that Copernicus was so afraid of the Catholic Church's ire that he waited to have his work published after he exited his mortal coil. Some sources suggest that Copernicus may have not even wanted his work to be published at all. This simple retelling obfuscates a far more nuanced and revealing reality. In 1533, Johann Albrecht Widmanstätter, papal secretary to Pope Clement VII, delivered a series of lectures, likely in the Vatican Gardens, explaining Copernicus's heliocentric model. Multiple contemporary accounts report that Pope Clement VII and several senior cardinals listened with great interest and were most impressed or pleased by the presentation. In recognition of Widmanstätter's efforts, the Pope presented him with a valuable gift, possibly a precious manuscript, which Widmanstätter later referenced in the front pages of the volume. This favorable reception was echoed a few years later, in 1536, Cardinal Nicolaus von Schönberg, who had attended the lectures, wrote to Copernicus directly, praising his work and urging him to publish his theory. In 1543, Nicolaus Copernicus published De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, dedicating the work to Pope Paul III. The book introduced the heliocentric model to a wider audience, but was initially met with little controversy. Crucially, the preface, added without Copernicus's consent by Lutheran theologian Andreas Osiander, framed the heliocentric system as a mere mathematical device for astronomical calculation, not a literal depiction of reality. This framing likely helped shield the book from early theological backlash. However, by the early 1600s, the status of heliocentrism had shifted. Galileo Galilei championed the model as physically true, not just a theoretical convenience. This clashed directly with biblical literalism, including verses such as Psalm 104:5, God set the earth on its foundations, it can never be moved, and Joshua 10:13, where the sun is described as standing still. In response, the Catholic Church took formal action. In 1616, it declared heliocentrism formally heretical, banning Copernicus's book until it could be corrected. In 1633, Galileo was tried by the Roman Inquisition, found vehemently suspect of heresy, and forced to recant his support for heliocentrism under threat of punishment. The Catholic Church's position on heliocentrism changed, not simply because the theory improved, but because its epistemological status evolved from a hypothetical model to a direct assertion of truth. When Copernicus published De Revolutionibus in 1543, The heliocentric model was introduced as a mathematical convenience, not a literal account of cosmic structure. The inclusion of Andreas Osiander's anonymous preface, which framed the model as an instrumental fiction, helped contain its implications. As long as heliocentrism operated within what Thomas Kuhn would call a phase of normal science, posing no direct challenge to the dominant Ptolemaic paradigm, it remained intellectually intriguing, but not ideologically dangerous. By the early 1600s, however, the situation had shifted. Galileo Galilei, building on Copernican theory, used telescopic evidence, such as the phases of Venus and the moons of Jupiter, to argue that heliocentrism was not just useful, but true. More radically, he insisted that empirical observation and mathematical reasoning could reveal truths independent of scriptural interpretation. In Kuhn's terms, Galileo was not just discovering new data, he was proposing a paradigm shift, one that relocated epistemic authority from theology to science. This shift posed a crisis not only for biblical literalism, but for the Church's broader control over knowledge production. The Church's response followed the logic of ideological preservation. As Louis Althusser might argue, the Church functioned as an ideological state apparatus, sustaining its authority through ritualized belief systems embedded in education, liturgy, and institutional language. Heliocentrism didn't just challenge astronomy, it disrupted the theological narrative that placed man and earth at the center of divine design. Accepting it would have meant dismantling the cosmological rituals that underpinned ecclesiastical power. At the same time, the Protestant Reformation had destabilized the Church's political authority, making it even less willing to accommodate theological disruption. Galileo's insistence that heliocentrism be taught as truth was seen not merely as scientific defiance, but as an act of religious insubordination. In 1616, heliocentrism was declared formally heretical. In 1633, Galileo was forced to recant, not because he lacked evidence, but because the Church could not afford to legitimize a new discursive regime that bypassed its interpretive gatekeeping. This is where Michel Foucault's analysis of discourse and power becomes indispensable. The Church's authority depended not just on belief, but on its ability to define what could be said, who could say it, and how knowledge was authorized. Galileo's use of vernacular language, his appeal to observation, and his refusal to submit interpretation to theological review broke the discursive rules. He wasn't just advancing a theory, he was speaking in a forbidden vocabulary. Ulrich Beck's theory of risk is also visible in the Church's response. Faced with the epistemic risk posed by heliocentrism, the institution did not admit systemic vulnerability. Instead, it outsourced blame to Galileo. The problem wasn't the Church's model. It was Galileo's pride, his method, his tone. His punishment was not about astronomy. It was about preserving institutional legitimacy through personal scapegoating. In the end, this episode is not just about science versus religion. It is about how systems of knowledge defend themselves when threatened. Rather than integrate new truths, the Church reasserted its control by redefining authority, delegitimizing dissent, and punishing those who attempted to speak outside its approved frameworks. Galileo was not silenced because he was wrong, he was silenced because he was right in a way the system could not absorb. The ideology closed ranks, prioritizing stability over correction, coherence over truth. In theory, science is self-correcting. It evolves by testing its own assumptions, refining its models, and discarding what fails. A hypothesis is only as strong as the evidence that survives scrutiny. A model holds until something better explains more. The strength of science lies not in its permanence, but in its capacity to revise. When it functions properly, science is a method of humbling. Copernicus overturned geocentrism. Pasteur refuted spontaneous generation. The shift from Newtonian physics to relativity did not mean science had failed. It meant it had matured. Each time a paradigm fell, it opened the door to more precise understanding. This is the scientific method at its best, bold in claim, ruthless in correction. But science does not exist in a vacuum. When a scientific framework becomes the foundation of professional identity, institutional legitimacy, and economic power, its behavior begins to change. What once welcomed challenge now repels it. What once adapted now defends. The model becomes a structure, not just a way of explaining the world, but a way of sustaining authority. At that point, the framework no longer behaves like science. It behaves like ideology. This is the shadow side of empiricism. The moment it becomes indispensable to a system of status, it becomes difficult to abandon, even when it no longer explains the phenomena it was built to describe. Scientific language remains. The terminology of metrics, precision, and protocols still dominate the vocabulary. But the method is no longer defined by falsification or revision. It is defined by preservation. The physiological training model is now one such system. Built on the scaffolding of laboratory metric, it still claims to be unimpeachably evidence-based. But its survival depends less on its accuracy than on its insulation. Challenges are not tested, they are dismissed. Alternatives are not compared, they are reinterpreted. Contradictions are not integrated, they are blamed on the user. This is not a sign of scientific rigor, it is a sign of structural self-protection. To understand how the physiological training model survives, despite its repeated failures to produce sustainable results, we must move beyond the logic of scientific inquiry and into the domain of ideological behavior. This is not merely a story about data, it is a story about power, language, and institutional survival. The system resists adaptation through mechanisms that have been studied across disciplines, in the philosophy of science, in sociology, in critical theory. These frameworks explain how dominant models preserve themselves, not by proving they are right, but by ensuring they cannot be proven wrong. The physiological training model is a resilient ideology, sustained through Kuhn's paradigm inertia, Althusser's ritualized compliance, Beck's blame deflection, and Foucault's discursive containment. Better methods do not replace the system. They are either dismissed or rewritten to support it. This is not an outdated theory waiting to be revised. It is a belief system fortified by institutional routines and reinforced by linguistic norms. The physiological model no longer functions as a framework for understanding adaptation. It functions as a structure of legitimacy. And like all ideological structures, it will continue to defend itself until its architecture is dismantled from the outside. When a system loses its capacity to respond to contradiction, it does not necessarily collapse. It adapts by developing defenses. One of the most effective defenses is not empirical, it is linguistic. Rather than engage with alternative models on their merits, the physiological training paradigm often neutralizes them through rhetorical dismissal. This is not critique. It is containment through vocabulary. It does so by deploying a repertoire of familiar terms that signal instantly and publicly that no further conversation is necessary. Terms like unscientific, anecdotal, bro-science, and old-school function not as analytic categories, but as semantic shutdowns. They are cues to the community. This idea is beneath consideration. Unscientific implies that the model lacks methodological rigor, even when it may simply reject the system's metrics. Anecdotal suggests irrelevance, even if the pattern is repeated across hundreds of athletes. Bro-science mocks training that emerges from embodied experience, especially when it doesn't appeal to quantified validation. Old-school frames legacy approaches like Lydiards or Maffetones as romantic relics. They are totems of nostalgia, but otherwise obsolete. This strategy works because it exploits a cultural reflex, the presumption that legitimacy is tied to quantification. In modern endurance culture, To be serious is to be scientific. And to be scientific is to use metrics, systems, and prescribed intensities. This conditioning is so deep that even athletes who thrive under intuitive or perception-based methods often apologize for it. They say things like, "I know it is not evidence-based," or "it is probably just in my head." Coaches who abandon threshold testing or zone targeting may still include lactate tests in their programs, not because the data is useful, but because its absence would feel illegitimate. Rhetorical dismissal makes the burden of proof infinite for any model that speaks in a different register. An effort-based system isn't just wrong, it is unintelligible. An athlete who says they train by feel must explain themselves. An athlete who trains by zone does not. This is how power operates through language. It makes its own grammar feel natural, and everything outside it feel unserious. The metric-based model becomes not just one approach among many, but the baseline against which all others must justify themselves. The consequences are internal as much as external. Athletes who sense they are improving without metrics often second-guess themselves. Coaches who observe better outcomes from perceptual regulation feel compelled to reframe their success in the system's language. It is probably just low zone 2. This is not intellectual humility. The coach's reframing is linguistic submission. It is the learned response of people who have been taught that if their experience doesn't match the metric, it is the experience, not the metric, that is suspect. When the physiological model cannot dismiss a challenge outright, it does something more insidious. It absorbs it. Rather than confront alternative frameworks on their own terms, the system reinterprets them within its own vocabulary, rendering them familiar and harmless. This is not an act of integration. It is an act of containment. By translating dissent into the language of the dominant paradigm, the system prevents meaningful disruption while appearing open to new ideas. Co-option is neutralization disguised as respect. The gold standard for an effective model is one that stands on its own. A model that has merged with cultural reality, becoming part ideology and part identity, does not meet that standard. It requires constant polishing to maintain its luster. It is not a standard of gold, it is a standard of brass. An example of this brass standard is how the model now treats Arthur Lydiard. His original system, developed in the 1950s and 60s, rejected the intensity-driven, system-targeted methods that define contemporary endurance training. In interviews, Lydiard regularly talked about how with the interval training of the time, it was impossible to write and follow a training schedule. He emphasized that it was impossible to control or predict how you would feel from one day to the next. To replace the dysfunction of the standardized and metrified intervals of the time, Lydiard developed a low-intensity approach to training. His core principles were frequency, duration, and effort regulation. He emphasized feeling, not measurement. Despite the emphasis or regulation of effort, people earnestly warned his runners against training with this madman. The belief was that their hearts would fail. His runners built endurance through long runs done at good effort, not based on zones, lactate scores, or ventilatory markers. He developed world-class athletes without ever using a heart rate monitor. Unlike modern training models, Lydiard's methodology was essentially unzoned, not periodized by system logic, and deeply embedded in perceptual awareness. Ironically, Lydiard is now often cited by proponents of the very kinds of systems he refused. He is retroactively described as doing polarized training before it had a name, or accidentally optimizing aerobic threshold through high volume. His rejection of physiological metrics is rewritten as unconscious compliance. His effort-based long runs are recast as Zone 2. His hill circuits become VO2 max maintenance. The system has no choice but to absorb him. His legacy is too effective to ignore, but it absorbs him on its own terms, stripping his method of its epistemological disobedience. The point is not to understand Lydiard. The point is to claim that he was always already part of the model. But there is another dimension to co-option. one that occurs not after the fact but during the act of critique itself. Consider Phil Maffetone. His core observation, that intensity undermines long-term adaptation, was absolutely correct. He saw what the system refused to see, that endurance improves through consistency, sustainability, and recovery, not through repeated exposure to physiological thresholds. But Maffetone, rather than stepping outside the paradigm, tried to express his insight within it. He built his method on heart rate, anchoring all training below a calculated maximum aerobic value. In doing so, he replaced the problem of system rigidity with the illusion of system control. Heart rate is deeply variable, context-sensitive, and often unrelated to functional effort. Maffetone's prescription, train beneath this number and improvement will follow, offered no mechanism, only correlation. It was improvement by eclipse, an accidental convergence mistaken for causality. The deeper failure, though, is structural. Maffetone intuited that the model was wrong, but he never escaped its logic. His method retained the language of control, of prescription, of intensity cap, and quantifiable target. As a result of this, his book is essentially empty. There are a few pages outlining the MAF formula. The rest is generic filler about stretching, nutrition, and lifestyle. There is no training theory, because the theory could not be constructed using the logic of a system that implicitly rejected MAF's theory while superficially embracing it because of the heart rate framing. MAF didn't fail because it didn't work. It failed because its own success was unreadable to the model it tried to remain loyal to. The system defended itself by making it impossible for even its critics to think outside its frame. Every training system eventually produces failure. Athletes stagnate, they burn out, they break. The question is not whether this happens, it is how the system responds when it does. In a scientific model, failure is a signal, something went wrong, and the method must be reconsidered. In an ideological system, failure is a threat, and the surest way to neutralize that threat is to assign the fault somewhere else. Sociologist Ulrich Beck called this the blame economy, a structural response in which risk is distributed by the system, but blame is personalized. Complex institutional failures are reframed as individual shortcomings. This reflex is central to the physiological training paradigm. When the system fails to produce improvement, it does not revise its model. The model revises its explanation. The athlete didn't fail because the training was wrong. They failed because they didn't follow it closely enough, or they slept poorly, or they didn't hydrate, or they're not ready to absorb the stimulus. The plan remains untouchable, only the user is flawed. This logic is recursive. A runner plateaus despite consistent effort, so they're told they need to accumulate more minutes in zone 4. A cyclist shows signs of chronic fatigue, so they're advised to tighten their nutrition or adjust their recovery. An athlete gets injured during a base building block, so the problem must have been progression speed, not the block itself. These are not meaningful analyses. They are stock responses designed to preserve the model's credibility. The more the system fails, the more it demands belief. This pattern creates a dangerous internalization. Athletes stop interpreting failure as a breakdown in the method. They see it as a reflection of their own insufficiency. They override warning signs because they have been trained to distrust their own perception. When fatigue shows up early, it is not a cue. Fatigue is a character flaw. When motivation drops, it is framed as softness. When adaptation stalls, the solution is more compliance. The system teaches them not to adjust, but to obey harder. Coaches often reinforce this dynamic, not because they are blind to the problem, but because they feel trapped within it. The plan has already been credentialed, justified, and prescribed. To abandon it would be to question the system that authorized it in the first place. So rather than change course, coaches double down. New tests, recalibrated thresholds, tighter pacing, stricter adherence. The athlete becomes a diagnostic project. The plan remains sacred. It is the athlete who must be fixed. The system's final move is to moralize compliance. Athletes who follow the plan are praised for their discipline. Those who deviate are viewed as reckless or unserious. The logic of performance becomes the logic of virtue. To be obedient is to be good. To question the model is to question the science, and by extension, oneself. Even athletes who succeed outside the model feel pressure to translate their results back into the system's language. They say they probably stayed in Zone 2 anyway, or that their field-based sessions happened to align with their FDP. This is not humility. It is ideological containment. Endurance culture relishes opportunities for repackaging. All athletes were neophytes once. They trained as neophytes with their own rationalizations and framings to guide them. The opportunity to articulate, in hindsight, what they were actually doing is common to the point of cliché. It becomes a Nash equilibrium in the symbol economy. The system welcomes standout performers who are willing to retrofit their stories to match the dominant model. One clear example appears in Keith Livingstone's Healthy Intelligent Training, 2008. Livingstone, with genuine intent, offers a modern interpretation of Lydiard's methodology. In the book, he prescribes a target heart rate to ensure runners execute the correct intensity. He claims that Lydiard's three-quarter effort corresponds to 75 to 85% of an athlete's heart rate reserve. Yet it is inarguable that Lydiard's athletes did not determine intensity in this way. Livingstone, a strong amateur runner who reportedly trained as much as 125 miles per week in his early 20s, was almost certainly not using the models or prescriptions he now promotes. In other disciplines, this would be absurd. But in endurance culture, post hoc rationalization is the norm. Athletes and coaches are rarely allowed to ethnographically describe what they actually did. Instead, entire models, likely never tested in the field as described, are published and accepted as effective approaches to training. This is not methodology. It is performative physiology. It doesn't have to be in the form of a book. It could be a conversation on a podcast where an athlete is brought forward and their training is aligned. Athletes want to appear knowledgeable and competent, so they are often eager to embrace that structure of explanation. This kind of training discussion functions more like religious conversion than empirical explanation. Like a catechism, the language of physiology speaks, and then the athletes respond accordingly. This kind of pseudo-proselytization is central to how the system defends itself. The next defense is more subtle still. It hides behind precision. It cloaks itself in numbers. It turns subjective experience into noise and metrics into gospel. It is the model's most persuasive illusion and its most sophisticated shield. No artifact of the physiological training model has done more to confer it with unearned authority than the metric. The numbers appear objective, precise, and powerful. VO2 max, lactate threshold, functional threshold power, heart rate variability, zone distribution. These are presented not merely as data points, but as truths. They promise insight. They imply mastery. They suggest that the body can be made legible, its systems optimized, its progress tracked with decimal point clarity. But this is not what metrics do. It is what they perform. The metric is not a window, it is a lens, and over time, that lens becomes a shield. Metrics offer the illusion of precision. A VO2 max score of 72.4 ml/kg min appears definitive. A lactate curve that breaks at 4 mmol seems conclusive. An HRV readiness score suggests actionable feedback. But these values are neither fixed nor absolute. VO2 max fluctuates significantly with altitude, temperature, hydration status, and even time of day. Lactate thresholds shift based on nutrition, sleep, stress, and test protocol. Heart rate variability is sensitive to caffeine, illness, emotional state, and acute life stress. FTP is a training artifact. It is defined by the test, not by the organism. Despite this, These numbers are used as the basis for prescriptive training decisions, athlete assessments, and performance forecasting. The system treats them as stable when they are anything but. This disconnect would be merely misleading if it didn't also override experience. But it does. Athletes are taught to defer to the device. If a session felt off, but the software labels it productive, it is treated as progress. If an athlete feels strong, but the numbers show they stayed beneath threshold, the effort is framed as incomplete. Perception becomes noise. The device becomes the judge. This reorients training around external validation, gradually eroding the athlete's capacity to interpret their own effort. Over time, the metric replaces the body, the map replaces the terrain. And yet the system invokes objectivity only when it serves its purpose. Metrics that reinforce the model, like lactate turn points or time in zone charts, are elevated as scientific. Frameworks based on perceptual regulation, central governor dynamics, or fatigue self-management are dismissed as subjective or insufficiently rigorous, even when they consistently produce durable results. This is not a debate about efficacy. It is a boundary enforced through epistemology. What can be measured is treated as real. What cannot be measured is denied legitimacy. The next layer of defense lies not in the numbers themselves, but in who is authorized to interpret them. Certification systems, academic programs, and institutional curricula all reward fluency in the metricized paradigm. The system is not just protected by data, it is reproduced by credentials. In theory, credentialing is meant to ensure competence. It exists to verify that a coach or practitioner has the knowledge, skills, and judgment necessary to guide athletes effectively. But in practice, credentialing often serves a different function. It defines what kind of knowledge is allowed to count. It does not just train people, it trains them to believe. And in the world of endurance training, credentialing functions as a mechanism of compliance, not inquiry. To be recognized as a real coach in most institutional settings, one must pass through a gate built entirely from the vocabulary and assumptions of the physiological paradigm. National governing bodies, private coaching certifications, and sports science curricula all demand fluency in the same system, zone training. VO2 max testing, lactate threshold interpretation, stimulus-response logic, and system-specific periodization models. These programs do not teach observation. They do not train coaches to read fatigue behaviorally, to adjust effort by proximity, or to evaluate durability through perceptual sustainability. Instead, they train coaches to write plans that fit the model. Certification programs like those from USA Triathlon, British Athletics, or the American College of Sports Medicine require practitioners to identify aerobic and anaerobic thresholds, calculate intensity zones, prescribe heart rate or power-based workouts, and justify periodization through systemic adaptation language. These are not fringe requirements, they are the core curriculum. Coaches are evaluated not on their ability to elicit improvement, but on their ability to cite the right terms, use the right graphs, and assign the right dosage. The test is not, can you coach? The test is, did you memorize the model? This credentialing logic forms a feedback loop. Athletes are told to trust certified coaches because they are certified. Certification programs justify their curricula by citing peer-reviewed studies. Those studies are produced by academic departments and research labs, shaped by the same system logic, funded, published, and rewarded based on the framework they reinforce. Together, these institutions form a closed epistemological circuit, a system that reproduces itself by credentialing those who conform and discrediting those who don't. The cost of this system is not just theoretical, it is practical and professional. Coaches who train athletes by feel, who build sustainable programs based on recovery signals and perceptual regulation, are not seen as innovators, they are seen as unserious. If their athletes succeed, The model takes credit. They were probably training in Zone 2 anyway. If they fail, the model assigns blame. That's what happens when you don't follow the science. To publish a book, present at a conference, or build a coaching business at scale, these coaches must either mask their methods in system language or risk being excluded entirely. In this way, dissent becomes not just unwelcome, but dangerous. The next mechanism completes this enclosure. What credentialing controls in practice, publication controls in principle. If a model cannot be published, it cannot be studied. If it cannot be studied, it cannot be taught. And if it cannot be taught, the system never has to admit it works. It is tempting to believe that the scientific literature reflects a neutral pursuit of truth, that it is a self-correcting ecosystem where better models rise by merit and weaker ones fall by disproof. But publication is not a mirror, it is a filter. It does not show the full range of what has been tried. It shows only what has been accepted. And in endurance training research, that acceptance is structured by a set of editorial and institutional priorities that consistently reinforce the physiological paradigm. To be published in the field of sports science, a study must do more than produce insight. It must conform to a narrow set of methodological expectations. It must feature quantifiable metrics. It must follow controlled protocols, minimize variability, and isolate the effect of specific system-targeted exposures. And it must present its findings in a framework that aligns with current physiological assumptions. These constraints are not inherently bad. They make certain types of inquiry possible, but they also make other types of inquiry impossible. What cannot be quantified, isolated, or translated into intensity distribution language is rarely funded, rarely conducted, and almost never published. Studies that foreground perception, regulatory behavior, or adaptive sustainability are often excluded, not because they are wrong, but because they do not fit the template. The logic is circular. Only system-based models are studied, so only system-based models are validated. Anything outside this scope is dismissed for lacking evidence, even though the system refuses to gather that evidence in the first place. The effects of this bias are not confined to academia. The literature shapes the curriculum. Coaching certification programs, sports science textbooks, and training platforms rely on peer-reviewed publications to determine what should be taught. If proximity-based regulation, sub-maximal repeatability, or perceptual calibration do not appear in those journals, they do not appear in the classroom either. Coaches are not told these models don't work. Coaches are taught that these models do not exist, and athletes who succeed with them are framed as outliers or anomalies, not as signals that the system's explanatory power might be incomplete. This is not epistemological oversight. It is ideological preservation. The physiological model maintains its dominance not because it continually outperforms its alternatives, but because it controls the terms under which performance is evaluated. It survives because it defines the framework in which its own legitimacy is judged, and it uses the control over what can be studies published and cited in the literature as the mechanism of that control. Behind this process lie economic incentives. Academic departments reward citation counts. Journals prioritize impact metrics. Research funding flows to projects that reinforce existing partnerships with wearable device companies, testing labs, and analytics platforms whose products depend on the continued relevance of system-based metrics. A study that questions the utility of heart rate zones or explores performance gains through unmeasured perceptual training threatens not just a paradigm, but a market. The result is a research landscape that appears diverse but is structurally uniform. What is studied is what the system already believes is important. What isn't studied remains illegible, not because it is ineffective, but because it has no format for expression. Evidence is not collected. Insight is not disseminated. Innovation is not rewarded. Bastioned by the citations it commissioned, The model places the crown on its own head. Training, for most athletes, is not a private act. It is a social performance. Runners post their sessions on Strava, log their workouts in Garmin or Training Peaks, discuss pacing charts in group chats, and compare VO2 max estimates on watches. None of this is merely functional. These behaviors are signals, broadcasts that say, I'm doing it right, I'm taking it seriously, I belong. A workout uploaded without pace, heart rate, or zone information feels incomplete, not because the session didn't happen, but because it cannot be socially verified. In this system, adaptation is secondary. Alignment is the point. The symbols of alignment are easily recognized. A Strava graph showing time in Zone 2, a screenshot of an FTP increase, an Instagram caption referencing quality stimulus or threshold work. Athletes do not post these things to deceive, they post them to signal seriousness. This is the cultural function of metrics, not to describe effort, but to validate identity. The numbers are not just proof of progress, they are proof of participation. Deviation from this script is rarely tolerated, and rarely needs to be. It is often corrected socially through confusion or mockery. An athlete who trains without a watch is asked, "How do you know if it was productive?" One who skips intervals in favor of feel is warned they're doing junk miles. A coach who avoids threshold language is dismissed as old school or unscientific. These are not technical disagreements. They are cultural rejections. The goal is not to debate, but to isolate, to make the deviant feel outside the circle of competence. Coaches are not exempt from this pressure. Even when they see athletes thrive using feel-based or regulation-led methods, they often reframe the success in the system's terms. They were probably in Zone 2 the whole time. Many feel compelled to include threshold testing or lactate metrics in their services, not because they believe they are necessary, but because they know potential clients expect to see them. To omit them would appear unqualified. This is the cost of peer enforcement, not that the system can't be questioned, but that no one wants to be the first to speak out of turn. Over time, this enforcement is internalized. Athletes no longer need to be told what counts, they feel it. They post graphs because they believe in them. They discuss what portion of the training block was done in threshold, not because they have tested the premise, but because they accept it as a law of causality. They experience guilt for deviating from the plan, even when they feel better doing so. The system teaches them to interpret discipline as correctness and suffering as evidence of investment. What begins as social signaling becomes moral belief. For many endurance athletes, training is not just something they do, it is how they define themselves. It provides structure, status, and self-concept. And because training is now organized around a rigid vocabulary of zones, metrics, and system prescriptions, participation in that vocabulary becomes a form of identity verification. An athlete who references VO2 max, lactate threshold, FTP, or recovery scores is not just describing a method. They are declaring their belonging. The system confers cultural legitimacy, and to use it fluently is to be seen as fluent in seriousness itself. This performance of belief is rarely examined. It is enacted. Athletes log their workouts using zone graphs and fitness curves, not because these tools necessarily help them train better, but because these are the markers of modern training. To question them is to appear unscientific. To abandon them is to appear unserious. Doubt is rarely voiced because it threatens more than performance outcomes. It threatens social standing. If you no longer believe in the science, how will you explain yourself? How will others know you're doing it right? For amateur and semi-competitive athletes in particular, this dynamic is especially powerful. They may lack the elite performances that confer inherent credibility, so they substitute technical fluency. To be taken seriously in their peer group, they must appear precise, data-driven, and compliant. Any deviation, training by feel, skipping intervals, ignoring FTP, risks ridicule. It also risks identity destabilization. If they are not following the science, what are they following? And what does that make them? This is why, when the system begins to fail, when fatigue sets in, progress halts, or injuries mount, many athletes do not abandon it. They double down. They assume the problem must be personal, a recovery issue, a fueling error, a psychological block. The plan is never at fault. To question the method would be to question the self, and the self has already been built around compliance. Belief in the model becomes psychologically entrenched. It is reinforced by community, performance rituals, and institutional authority. Even when results suggest otherwise, the athlete has no other system of meaning. There is no widely accepted alternative, no credentialed countermodel, no platform where I trained by feel and got better is enough. Doubt becomes destabilizing. To step outside the system would mean more than adopting a new method. It would mean losing your bearings. It would mean becoming someone else. In science, falsifiability is the line between theory and belief. A model must expose itself to contradiction. It must risk being wrong. The possibility of failure is what allows refinement, replacement, or evolution. Karl Popper called this the logic of discovery. For knowledge to grow, it must be testable and it must be capable of not holding up. If a model cannot be wrong, it is no longer explanatory. It is doctrinal. The physiological training model, as it is practiced today, no longer meets this standard. It cannot be disproven, because it has built a logic loop so tight that every outcome reinforces its authority. If an athlete follows a threshold-based plan and improves, the model is validated. If they plateau or burn out, the plan was sound, but the athlete misapplied it. If another athlete succeeds using intuitive regulation-based training, they are reframed as either genetically gifted or secretly compliant with physiological principles. If that same athlete fails, the model warns, this is why we follow the science. No matter what happens, the model wins. This is not adaptation. It is armor. The system does not learn from contradiction. It metabolizes it. Any deviation is explained away, any anomaly recoded, any critique absorbed or dismissed. Coaches revise prescriptions but never the premise. Athletes recalibrate zones and double down on recovery strategies without ever questioning whether the system itself might be misaligned. The model is treated as inviolable. Its failures are never conceptual. They are always logistical. This is the logic of unfalsifiability. It is circular and redundant. It creates a universe in which outcomes are no longer evaluated against the model. The model becomes the lens through which all outcomes must be interpreted. This allows the physiological framework to present itself as responsive and evidence-based, while actually remaining inert. Its complexity, zones, thresholds, tests, stimuli, is not designed to be corrected. It is designed to be defended. The system grows more elaborate, not more accurate. New metrics are introduced: heart rate variability, training readiness scores, recovery indexes, but none of them challenge the central premise that exposure to specific system intensities drives adaptation. These additions do not increase explanatory power, they increase insulation. The model never questions whether the act of targeting systems might be the problem. It simply builds a more intricate lattice of monitoring to protect its assumptions. The cost of this logic is paid by athletes. They plateau, overtrain, and break down, but are told the data was right and the application was flawed. They feel worse but continue the plan, believing that discipline will eventually turn fatigue into progress. Their inability to improve is seen as a failure of commitment, not a sign that the system is incompatible with their body. The coaches, in turn, are trained to believe the same. Their job is to fine-tune the program, not to doubt its logic. Unfalsifiability is not a byproduct of the model's popularity. It is a strategy that guarantees survival through semantic control. The model has fused its language, authority, cultural norms, and feedback mechanisms into a structure that preempts disproof. It does not respond to failure by revising. It responds by redirecting the blame. The paradigm never admits error because it has already decided that error must come from elsewhere. By the time a paradigm becomes unfalsifiable, it no longer needs to avoid contradiction. It simply recasts all contradiction as confirmation. This is the final mechanism by which the physiological training model protects itself, not through denial, but through interpretive capture. It doesn't just resist alternative explanations. It redefines them. It absorbs external outcomes into its internal logic and neutralizes contradiction by translating it into its own terms. Interpretive capture occurs when a dominant framework controls not only what is measured, but how meaning is assigned. This process is not accidental, it is ideological. The model absorbs anomalies not to understand them, but to disarm them. No matter how contrary the evidence, it is recoded as support. Over time, this ensures that the system encounters no true counterexamples, only misunderstood ones. An athlete who thrives without compliance is not a challenge. They are a curiosity to be explained away. Their training must have included hidden structure. Their physiology must have been unique. The outcome is always folded back into the system, which then expands not by evolving, but by enveloping. As this logic spreads, the space for genuine alternatives collapses. No method can remain outside the model's interpretive reach unless it is aggressively protected. If all success is rewritten in the language of zones and metrics, then no success can be used to argue against that language. Even disagreement is recast as a dialect. The physiological paradigm becomes a semantic enclosure, an environment where nothing truly new can grow, because everything that emerges is retrofitted into the old. This is how the physiological model moves from science to mythology. It stops describing what is happening. It starts determining what counts as happening. It becomes not a framework for interpreting training, but a filter that rewrites all training to confirm itself. The map doesn't just replace the terrain, it reshapes the terrain to match the map. A model that cannot be wrong is already broken. A model that rewrites all evidence in its image is no longer explaining the world. It is replacing it.